All right, welcome back, everybody. Sorry that we didn't give you a very long break. We're just trying to give you a content-packed program, so you can't say that you didn't get your bang for your buck on this one. So we're moving right along with our program. You've seen a lot about arbitration today, but we're going to now talk about the other big fish, I guess, when it comes to ADR, which is mediation. We have with us today Theo Cheng, who practices arbitration and mediation out of his office in Princeton Junction. I will say, because he's probably too shy or modest to mention this himself, that I learned on LinkedIn that Theo was actually named ADR Practitioner of the Year, I believe. And I'm not sure if that was a state or a national honor, probably a national one. So either way, that's a big honor.
So thank you, Jonathan.
We've got 80,000 attorneys in New Jersey, and I don't know how many mediators and arbitrators, but a lot of them. So to be the ADR Practitioner of the Year is quite a notable achievement, and we're proud to have you as part of this panel. So instead of what Keith did, which was to go through the arbitral process, why don't you tell us a little bit about virtual mediation?
Sure. So let me pull up a, Emily, if you wouldn't mind allowing me to screen share, I'll pull up a PowerPoint on my side. Okay, let me pull up my PowerPoint and then we'll get started. But basically, okay. So my name is Theo Cheng, and I'm here to talk about the ins and outs of virtual mediation. Basically, I want to start by just telling you that I'm an independent arbitrator and mediator here in New Jersey. I practice in the greater metropolitan New York area, as well as New Jersey and parts of Pennsylvania. I'm also an ADR trainer and an adjunct professor at New York Law School. For present purposes, I also want to note that I'm the president of the Garibaldi Inn of Court, which is the oldest inn of court in the nation devoted exclusively to ADR, located in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And as of yesterday, I'm also the immediate past chair of the New York State Bar Association's Dispute Resolution Section. Here's what I'd like to try and accomplish in the next 50 minutes or so. Just go over some brief definitions about virtual mediation and a little history. Then sort of amplify what Keith went through when talking about arbitration, and to talk obviously in the context of virtual mediation, and take you through the steps of a pre-mediation conference, as well as what I call VTC, or video teleconferencing protocol. And then go through some practical considerations that you want to keep in mind. And then finally, some benefits and concerns that arise in using a video teleconferencing platform to do mediation. So let's begin with some basic definitions. Some of these terms are probably terms you've heard already in articles in the news, but in person is exactly what you think it is. The physical personal appearance or action of an individual, namely face-to-face. This is what all of us as mediators have been trained to do. This is what we expect mediation to be like. Obviously, things have changed now with the pandemic, and we are starting to see things like words like online and virtual. Online technically means controlled by or connected to a network or computer. Virtual is another term that's often used interchangeably with online. And for today's purposes, I don't want to get into a big semantic discussion about the difference, but virtual to me means not physically existing, but made to appear so through the use of software. And in my mind, that includes both audio and video teleconferencing platforms. Because today's day and age, if you run a mediation through telephone, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that's also being controlled by software ultimately. It may not be software that you have control over if you're using a simple teleconferencing line, but there are some software platforms that allow you to have some more control, like, for example, Synexis, which allows you to use telephone mediations and has the capability to do breakout rooms. So let's talk a little bit about online dispute resolution first. Which is a term that's out there in the literature, also known as ODR. The first thing I want to note about ODR is it's not new at all. For those of you who've had the opportunity to do any kind of remote deposition or have for some reason had to bring in a witness, a single witness from the outside who was located far away but didn't want to pay for the travel. You may have already done this. Use Zoom or some other platform to bring in that one witness. And in fact, in the international arena, international arbitrations have been done completely through video teleconferencing platforms for many, many years. But the advent of ODR really came in the early 1990s with the expansion of business-to-business and business-to-consumer e-commerce. And in particular, in the late 1990s, eBay conducted a pilot project over its platform and handled over 150 disputes during a 2-week period, which at that time was the largest number of disputes ever handled in an online basis. And since that time, basically, eBay has established ODR as a part of its site. And as of 2010, was handling annually upward disputes each using this platform. ODR has been around for a while now. It's just become far more a part of our vocabulary now that the pandemic has hit and we're not allowed actually to conduct in-person mediation. So what is virtual mediation? Virtual mediation is essentially a way in which you can mimic the real world. And I'll be the first to tell you that mediation can most certainly be done virtually. You have to remember that mediations have been conducted by telephone for many, many years. In fact, still today, I volunteer as a mediator with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, where I conduct all of my mediations via telephone. Virtual mediation is not specific to any particular platform. I will try and focus a little bit on Zoom, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Zoom, obviously very popular, and probably people have been exposed to it. But it's not specific to virtual mediation. There are many, many other platforms out there, and they encompass both audio and video capabilities. But as with all software-driven interfaces, each platform has its own special features and limitations. So in understanding virtual mediation, as is true with virtual arbitration, is that you have to understand the salient features and the limitations of the platform, and then become comfortable enough with them so that you can focus the participants on the task at hand. So no one's asking anyone to be an expert on Zoom. I don't claim that I'm some sort of expert on the platform, but I know enough so that I can get other people comfortable with it, and I know enough to manipulate the settings so that I can provide a service to the participants who retain me as a mediator. Again, virtual mediation attempts to mimic the situation where participants have gathered together in a single room. And in order for that to happen, a few things have to be true. First, you have to be able to see each other and interact with one another in real time. The platform really just provides a virtual space in which everyone would gather. You have to be able to log into the platform from some device. That could be a computer, like a desktop, or it could be a laptop, tablet, and I've even seen people attempt to participate in mediation through smartphone. I don't recommend that, but it's possible. You have to be located where you have access to secure high-speed internet, or you can remedy any kind of internet weakness or outage by, for example, purchasing a Wi-Fi booster for your room or your house, or in my case, for example, I oftentimes use my hotspot on my iPhone, which is a good backup. Because I've got a wife who works and pretty much is on wall-to-wall Zoom calls every day. I've got 2 kids doing online instruction. You can imagine that the bandwidth from time to time does drop. And also, I've also noticed that from time to time, the bandwidth usage in my neighborhood can change. For example, around the 5 o'clock time period, I tend to experience really bad internet, probably because a lot of people are waiting till the end of the day, getting online, starting to stream things or check their emails or whatnot. And so all of us experience a drop. And so in some respects, these sort of remedies are helpful. The best situation is, of course, if you can hardwire connect your system to the internet, and that's called an Ethernet connection or a T1 connection. If you can do that, that would eliminate, in large part, many of the bandwidth issues that you may have. Finally, you have to have a reasonably working microphone and or speaker in order to be able to transmit audio and receive audio. And it's preferable, of course, in today's day and age, if you're trying to use a video conferencing platform, to have some sort of camera or webcam to transmit and receive video. Virtual mediation then proceeds as if it were an in-person session. The mediator convenes the session by beginning with greetings and introduction, then proceeds with welcoming remarks and sets the ground rules. The participants can also share perspectives or otherwise engage in what would be typically called a joint session. It's really no different than a typical video conference call. And in that regard, you may easily find yourself after a little while finding no real difference. And these days, since people are so ubiquitously on video conference calls, you might even forget that you're actually in some sort of a video platform as opposed to just having a conversation with people over the video. So let me take you a step back now and talk about sort of the phases of mediation. So this is where understanding how the platform interfaces with mediation practice makes sense. In my practice, I always hold a pre-mediation conference call with at least the counsel. I invite the parties to attend as well, but the idea is for them to converse with me about certain logistics and housekeeping matters. And you would, in this call, and sometimes I do this by telephone just to give myself a break from having all these Zoom calls, but it can be done over video or it can be done with a simple telephone call. Your agenda items are exactly as you would in a normal mediation. You would ascertain the procedural posture of the case, for example. Is this a case that's court annexed and has been ordered into mediation? Is this a case that's pre-filing? Has there been an arbitration started and this is a sort of a parallel track that's being taken care of? So you would try and figure that out. Then you might discuss whether or not any limited or informal exchange of documents or information might be helpful to having a productive session. And then you would facilitate and help the parties come to some agreements about that. You would identify who's going to attend the session itself. Obviously, people with authority and decision-making power, but also anybody who might be providing moral support, people who might have influence on the decision maker. If there's a carrier involved, you want to know if the adjuster is going to participate. If you need an interpreter or a translator, whether that person is going to participate. Then you also, in my practice at least, I usually use pre-mediation submission. And so I'll want to determine with the parties what the content of those submissions are, as well as when to schedule the exchange of those submissions, whether they're ex parte or they're going to be confidential or exchanged, I should say, publicly. Then finally, you'll set the date and time for the session. Obviously not the location because you're going to be doing it virtually, but you want to set the actual date and time for the session. Now, what's different then is, most importantly, you're going to want to cover what I characterize as VTC protocols. These are very similar to the things that Keith talked about in his session relating to an arbitration, but what I'm going to go through are specific questions and sort of a checklist of items that you might want to cover in a typical mediation setting. First and foremost, of course, is VTC protocol, the VTC platform. What platform are the participants agreeing to use? On this slide, you'll see that I've got about a dozen different platforms shown for you. Some of them I'm sure you've heard of before, Zoom being the most popular, and I'll explain why in a second. But there are plenty of others. And for example, WebEx that's been discussed before. WebEx is used a lot by corporations and law firms. And you want to be mindful. I just had a pre-mediation conference last week where an attorney said that his law firm really prefers that the attorneys use WebEx, but they were willing to use Zoom. I told the attorney I was willing to learn the platform, but they and the plaintiff's attorney were willing to go with Zoom, so that eliminated that hurdle for me. But Zoom happens to be the most popular in large part because of all the articles in the media, but also more practically speaking, Zoom is a very feature-rich platform. It just has a lot of bells and whistles attached to it, even though it wasn't created specifically for arbitration or mediation. Zoom also has probably one of the best technical support, IT support helplines. And most importantly, for those of us who are going to be conducting these and hosting these sessions, Zoom has a very robust server background. So for example, one of these platforms recently was being used for a mediation competition. Hundreds of participants were going to log in and undertake virtual mediations as part of that competition. Within just a few hours, what ended up happening was that the platform just couldn't handle that many users logging in at the same time, and the servers were overwhelmed and the whole system crashed. That's not something you want happening on your VTC platform. Zoom has over 13 million users now and can accommodate many, many users at the same time. And so it has a large amount of server bandwidth to support the kinds of video conferencing that occurs all across the platform. It's also the most well-known in the sense that every time I raise Zoom as a possibility, people already know what it is. They may not be experts on it. They may not have used it very much themselves, but they've certainly heard of it. But if I start mentioning things like Hi5 or Blue Jeans or Modron, I'm not sure that people know what I'm talking about. And I think that presents yet another hurdle, because if they're not familiar with the platform, they need advanced training or education on the platform. That's going to be something you have to build into the mediation timeline. You also want to talk about technical setups too, right? Are you going to have more than one monitor? You're going to have a headset like I have now? Are you going to have, do you need cameras? Do people have those pieces of equipment available? If not, how long will it take for them to get them? So these are the kinds of questions you need to sort of ferret out at the very beginning when you're choosing your platform in the first instance. Next is how to handle who actually attends a session. I mean, we already talked about who people are anticipating attending the session, but the questions I'm thinking about are the things that Keith mentioned at the very beginning. Do you enable a waiting room or a lobby to have people coalesce and wait there like everyone in this program did before entering into the main room? And if so, you might want to tell them like that you won't be waiting there longer than 5 minutes past the appointed hour, so that people aren't left unawares as to what's going on. Do you lock the room after all the attendees have arrived so that no one else can come into the room? Locking is a security feature. It's optional. The only bad thing about locking the room is that if someone gets disconnected, they're going to have to get in touch with you to let you know that, and so that you can unlock the room and let them back in. Otherwise, no one can kind of use the link or retry and reconnect. I also asked if everyone would agree that no one is present with a participant unless previously disclosed. I think that goes to some of the concerns that people are raising about whether or not there are other people off camera that you can't see. I mean, obviously, my camera is a pretty wide angle camera, but it doesn't cover below my chest area. It doesn't cover beyond my green screen. And you want to make sure that the people are testing that there's nobody else in the room. Whether to record a session is another issue. It really doesn't come up in the mediation context except in one small example, which I'll cover a little later in this hour. But if you are going to decide to record it for one reason or another, there are a whole number of issues. First and foremost, if you're not going to record, you ought to get an agreement from everybody that there's going to be no recording of any kind whatsoever. These days, there are screen capture programs that people can have on their computers. You could surreptitiously turn on your iPhone and record using the voice memo function. But you want to make sure everyone's in agreement that there will be no recording at all. But if you are going to record, then the same issues that Keith raised before, things like whether it's going to be on a local basis or on a cloud recording basis, and then who has access to it and who's going to maintain it. I, as a mediator, certainly do not want to retain a recording of this. I usually tend to shred my notes after the mediation anyway. So I don't want to be the keeper of that. So I think those are the kinds of conversations you need to have with the participants in the mediation. There's also the possibility, I haven't heard of it happening very much over at least the Zoom platform, but inadvertently being able to hear a communication and what are you going to do in those circumstances. I analogize this to the situation of an inadvertent production of documents, for example. Do you inform the mediator? Do you get agreement that people inform the mediator that it's happened? Do you, as a default, agree that you're going to immediately cease listening or viewing the communication and inform the affected individual? Or do you just, or do you not do anything? I think this is a sort of an issue that could happen. Again, I haven't heard it happen on the Zoom platform, but this is a piece of software like any software. It's going to have bugs and glitches, so it's always good to sort of cover this as a possibility. We'll talk about caucus rooms and breakout rooms in just a minute, but obviously the mediator is going to want to go back and forth if you have those caucus rooms. There are obviously some mediations where you completely stay within a joint session, but for the situation where you have broken people and assigned them into caucus rooms, how is the mediator going to know or notify people that he or she is going to enter into a caucus room? Zoom, again, was not made for mediation. It doesn't really have a virtual knock or a virtual chime to let people know. If the mediator simply waltzes into a breakout room, you have the possibility, first of all, it's rude, but more importantly, you could walk into a confidential communication. You could be breaking attorney-client privilege. You don't want any of that to happen. So you might want to, for example, use the broadcast chat function in Zoom. That allows the mediator to send a message to everyone, regardless of where they're located, telling them that I'm going to now enter into breakout room number 1. The drawback of that is, even in the real world, I don't tell everyone where I'm going every minute of the time. So I'm not sure I want to use that feature. What you could do is have the email or the cell phone numbers of the counsel, and then text or email them in advance. That's what I do. And then I tell them I'm going to come in like a minute, and then that's their opportunity to tell me if I should hold off, or let me know that they'll text me back when they're ready to see me. If caucus rooms are not available, because not all video teleconferencing platforms have them, then you can go back to the old disconnect, reconnect, which is exactly what I do in the telephone mediations. In other words, you get on the phone with the party that you want to speak with. When you're done in that caucus, you disconnect, and then I call the next party, put them into a conference room, and discuss. So that's one way to deal with that. It's somewhat cumbersome. It's not my preferred method, but if that's the only available sort of technology you have, then that's one possibility to get around that problem. You also need to, as everyone has noted, there's always the possibility of getting booted off the platform, one way or another. You suffer an internet outage, or there's a software glitch or some kind of spike in electricity. If anyone becomes disconnected or cannot see or hear, you ought to have a protocol for what to do in those situations. The most obvious one is to try reconnecting. And just a note here, if you are in a breakout room and you get disconnected, either voluntarily or involuntarily, when you try and reconnect, you're going to be reconnecting back into the main room, not into a breakout room. So it's almost as if you left the building altogether. And so if you are coming back in from a breakout room, you're going to have to ask the mediator to put you back into the breakout room. And also, if the mediator has the waiting room function enabled, the mediator will get a sort of a pop-up telling the mediator that someone is in the waiting room. So that's one way to figure that out if you haven't had a chance to contact the mediator in advance about being disconnected. You could obviously always let the mediator know by email or text. And obviously, if someone's experienced a total outage of some kind, then it might be reason to suspend the mediation altogether and sort of try again a different day when things are better reconnected. And that, of course, brings to one of the last protocols, which is that I recommend that everyone exchange email addresses and cell phone numbers, at least between the mediator and the counsel. And the reason is because that way everyone has an alternate way to communicate with each other outside of the platform. And that brings up a different issue or a related issue as to who has control. Because as was demonstrated both in the video that you saw, as well as in Keith's presentation, the host of the platform usually has the most control over the platform. And unless you're sharing host capabilities, the mediator is essentially in control of who goes where and what breakout rooms that they go to. That doesn't always sit well with counsel. I've had counsel tell me that they would prefer that they be more in control. For example, if one counsel wants to speak to another counsel and they're in breakout rooms, the only way to do so is to let the mediator know. And then the mediator has to create yet another breakout room and put them both in there. Some counsel would prefer that they have the freedom to just go and find the other counsel themselves. And if that's the case, then maybe the counsel should be in charge of the platform, or at least have co-host responsibilities. Alternatively, of course, the counsel can just pick up the phone and call the other counsel. So there are other ways around this. But I think just being able to have a different way of communicating with each other is probably a good thing. It's not something I would have ordinarily done in my pre-mediation conference call agenda, but I do that now as a matter of course. Finally, I just want to point out that obviously in New Jersey, when we do mediation, any final term sheet you arrive at, a memorandum of understanding, or even a consummated settlement agreement has to be memorialized in order to comply with Willingboro Mall. Otherwise, you run into enforceability problems later if it's totally oral. And the question comes is, how do you handle that under a video teleconferencing platform? And there are a few options. Here is one where you might consider turning on the record feature. You could record orally reading the terms, the final terms and conditions, with everyone present in the room, and then make sure that the mediator obtains individual assent to those terms and conditions on the record recorded. Another option is to turn on the annotation feature that Keith mentioned when you're sharing a document. So if you have, for example, an MOU and you have signature lines, you could turn on the annotation feature and have people annotate the document with signature or some sort of mark that indicates their assent to it, and then either download that document or screen capture that document. And finally, if you're capable of doing this, you can incorporate in a third-party software like DocuSign or Write Signature into the, by sharing it, share screen. And then by doing that, you can have everyone electronically sign the document, and then you have an actual e-signature or e-sign document to share around. So any one of these possibilities would allow you to ensure that you've got some kind of memorialization before you leave the mediation. So on the next page is an example, and you'll get a copy of these slides, so I apologize for the small print, but this is an example of something I send out after I've had my call with the counsel. So I usually do an email recap, which memorializes pertinent things we've talked about, like who's going to be attending and whether there's going to be any documents or information exchange. But these are also the VTC platform protocols that I would memorialize. It's a little hard to read, so I'll quickly go through this. And I'll say that you want to, in the first paragraph, I talk about attendance, that I will have people, I would lock the meeting once people are in, and that we can invite people afterwards if we want to, if we all agree to. Number two is talking about inadvertent interruptions in the connectivity and what to do about that. And also that there'll be an agreement that no one will be physically in the same room as the mediation participant. Number three is the no recording agreement by any means. Number four is the sort of inadvertent viewing or seeing or hearing of a confidential communication. Five is that I will text counsel when I'm about to enter into a breakout room, which is what Zoom calls the caucus rooms. And number six is if you are disconnected, that you will let me know by email or text or phone. And if you are disconnected when you're in a breakout room, you're going to be returned back to the main room, where I will then bring you back into a breakout room. And finally, I will then, in number seven, I write down everyone's email addresses and cell phone numbers so that everyone knows an alternate way to communicate with each other. Obviously, protocols can be shorter or longer. You don't have to cover all the topics that I went over in the list, but I think these are some of the topics I think you'll want to cover depending on the circumstances, so that you have a good handle on how the mediation is going to progress. So let's talk a little bit now about what to do in terms of preparing for the session itself once you've had all these protocols ironed out. So first, you want to properly set up the equipment. And this is important not only for yourself, but also for all the participants, counsel and clients and client representatives. I highly recommend downloading whatever platform you're going to be using. It has been mentioned that you can participate in a Zoom meeting simply by clicking on the link and using your browser. It's possible, but doing so doesn't allow you to have a lot of settings to customize things for yourself, and you might find that you'll be more comfortable playing around with the platform if you downloaded it onto your computer in advance. You want to think about whether you want one or two monitors. Much like for in an arbitration where you might want documents on one side and video on the other, it might be easier if you don't cram everything together in one monitor. Particularly in some of my mediations where we're looking at a lot of contractual documents, I'll want the contract document to be blown up, but then that kind of inhibits the ability to see everyone at the same time. You want to ensure adequate internet connection. Again, we talked about whether or not you want a booster, want to use your hotspot, or if you're lucky and you're able to get P1 connection, even better. You want to close any unnecessary tabs or applications because they eat up power. And that's another thing too. If you're running off a laptop or a smartphone, you want to make sure that you've got a battery hookup and keep an eye on that so that you don't suddenly end up in a situation where you've run out of battery and you're forcibly disconnected from the platform. But closing other unnecessary tabs and applications can help minimize distractions. Turning off notifications on your emails, for example, some of us have that on Outlook. Silencing your phone, all these things can contribute to having a much smoother mediation process. Using a headset like I have can also eliminate ambient noise. So for example, right now across the street, there's a neighbor is having some landscapers do a lot of work in their front yard. You can't hear that right now because I have a headset on that blocks out that noise. But if you're using your computer audio, you might pick up that extra noise. You may recall a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court had oral arguments and there was an embarrassing flush that was heard. That again could possibly have been avoided if everyone had been using headsets or at least muted themselves when they were not speaking. Also, there are some people who have reported that using the computer speaker for your audio doesn't lead to the best audio quality, both for the listener as well as the speaker. And so you might consider trying around playing with a headset, see if that works. And it also adds for privacy too. That's the important thing. If you happen to be in a situation where there are lots of other people floating around, at the very least, the only thing they'll hear is you speaking and not everyone else in the mediation session speaking. You should choose the best location, obviously, to participate in a mediation setting. Select a private room if you have a private office or something like that, or a place where no one else is going to be. If you don't have that luxury, at least pick a place where there's likely to be less foot traffic. Maybe there's a living room where people aren't going to be in very much and they're going to confine themselves to the kitchen or upstairs bedroom. Ensure that the space is quiet. Do the best you can to, again, minimize other appliances and things that might make noise. Turn off the ringer to your phone during the time. I'm talking about the house phone now so that you don't get interrupted with that. Eliminate other distractions. If you have pets, try and lock them in a different room so that they don't come barging into your room. Let everyone else in the household know that you'll be in a mediation so that you don't want to be disturbed. You also want to prepare the participants. You have to make sure that you know how to operate the platform, but they also need to know. They certainly don't need to know it as well as you, but they certainly need to feel comfortable with it so that they understand how is to log on and adjust their view and make sure that they're comfortable participating. And in that regard, I want to echo what Brady and James said earlier, that it's so helpful to have host orientation sessions with, if not with everyone, then certainly groups of people. One of the luxuries we have as a mediator is to engage in ex parte communication. So if you want to do it with only the plaintiff's side or only the defendant's side, that's okay. I think that's the likelihood of things going wrong will be minimized and delays will be denied if you hold these orientation sessions in advance. And you also want to take that opportunity to review the BTC protocols that you agreed to so that everyone fully understands what the ground rules are. Although I usually go over them again during the opening welcoming remarks that I make to make sure people haven't forgotten and are comforted in knowing that if something should go wrong, and the likelihood is that with technology you never know, that there's at least a backup plan in place. Finally, of course, you need to send out the information for the Zoom meeting or the WebEx meeting. Most people do that via email, and that's perfectly fine. But you'll need to schedule on your calendar and send out the appropriate login information. In Zoom, you're allowed to send it out using your personal meeting ID or a randomly created meeting ID that Zoom generates for you. And the biggest thing about doing this, of course, is to make sure that you don't share this invitation in any kind of public forum at all. Don't post it up in a place where other people who are not invited to this mediation can get to it. Otherwise, you're going to have the possibility of unwanted guests. In that regard, I highly recommend not using the personal meeting ID because that's specific to the user. And if that ever gets compromised, you can never use it again. Rather, you should, or at least you need to change it. I'd rather just use the random generator that creates a different ID every single time. And if you're going to have a continued mediation session, some of my sessions have 2 sessions. I use a totally different login for that second session, so as to, again, to make sure I maintain confidentiality and security. Let me take a moment at this point, because it was raised in the chat earlier today about Zoom bombing. Zoom bombing was a phenomenon that we don't hear about too much anymore, but was obviously prevalent back in the March and April time period. Zoom bombing is a situation when some unwanted guest shows up in your Zoom meeting and then obviously takes over, shares things that you don't want shared or says things that you don't want said, clearly someone that should not be there. The reason why Zoom bombing was happening was largely because of what I just mentioned. People were using their meeting ID, somehow compromising it by posting it somewhere publicly, either on your LinkedIn platform or on Twitter, or posting it up in some place where someone could get it in a chat room. And so when they kept using the same meeting ID, it was already compromised. Or again, they were sending the invite out in a way that other people would get access to it. And once people have that link, then people can just Zoom right into your meeting. As a result of that situation, Zoom then created certain defaults into the system. So for example, now you can consider password protecting your meeting. In fact, that's the default. If you want to remove the password, you can. A second thing you might do if you're really concerned about this is to separate. Right now, the default is that you can create a Zoom link where the password is embedded in that link. So in other words, you click it and the participant goes right into the meeting. Or you can separate the password out and just create a link that just has the link to the Zoom platform, and then people have to, a dialog box will come up where participants will have to type in the specific password for that meeting. And by separating the two, you are essentially creating two-factor authentication. And that way, and if you really want to be secure, do not send the password out in the same method that you sent out the link. So in other words, if you send people the Zoom link via email, send the password through some other means, like a text or something, so that if the emails get hacked somehow, no one is able to totally get into your Zoom meeting if for some reason you have a very, very confidential mediation. So Zoom bombing, that sort of takes care of Zoom bombing in large part. The other two features that Zoom highly recommended that people use is the waiting room, so that you can vet the people that are waiting to get in. If they're not supposed to be there, you can just simply eject them. And then, of course, every host has the ability to remove unwanted guests, so you can always do that at your leisure if someone comes in and you figure out they're not supposed to be there. Now, none of this is going to prevent true hacking. Zoom bombing is not really hacking, but a hacker is someone who can actually get into the code and insert themselves and somehow find a way onto your platform. Those people, if they're determined to get into your meeting, they're going to get in. There's nothing you can do to prevent that from happening, but you can create a lot of deterrents along the way to prevent most of your meetings from being hijacked in any way. Largely, ever since Zoom has introduced and told people about these sort of protections, and as people have adopted them, they've largely disappeared. I don't hear too many reports of Zoom bombing anymore, but it's always something to keep in mind. Also, one other way in which I maintain confidentiality is when I send out the meeting link information, for example, I try and make sure that I only name the session. The host is allowed to name the name of the meeting. I don't put the parties' names in the name of the meeting. I use the case number or some other code, maybe the lawyer's name, so that I don't give away the confidentiality that these parties mediate. Now, on the next mediation, then it doesn't really matter as much. For some of the mediations I do, a large number of them are pre-filing, a large number of them are in confidential arbitrations, and they don't want it known that they're also mediating, and so I make sure to remove the name from the name of the meeting. You may also consider sending out a calendar entry invite along with the email so that people can simply accept that calendar entry. You don't have to worry about copying the Zoom entry or creating their own calendar entry. That way you can ensure that everyone's got it. Again, it's up to you and your preferences of how you want to do this. Obviously, if you don't have the client and client representative emails, then you can't send them the Outlook calendar entry, but it's definitely an option. Finally, I just wanted to make sure that I re-emphasize that it's very important to do some sort of platform testing, dry run of the platform and the setup with the participants. It doesn't have to be all at the same time, but at some point before your actual mediation session, it will help eliminate or at least minimize the possibility of things going wrong. But what are the things you want to do during a testing are things like you want to test the microphones and speakers, make sure they're working. You want to check your camera angle and make sure that there's proper eye contact so you can avoid the unnatural looks or weird body language or people coming too close to the camera, as Jonathan noted before. You want to talk about lighting to make sure that people aren't in shadows. As Keith noted, it's always best to have lighting either in front of you or overhead. And you might want to practice making sure that people have the right lighting in place. You don't want to, for example, sit with your back to an open window because then the light from outside will essentially create a shadow across your face. Sound, feedback, background noise, all those things are things you can test. We talked a little bit about virtual background. I have one now. You know, in an arbitration setting, I never allow virtual backgrounds because I don't want people to be using that as some way to mask other people in the room or anything like that. In a mediation, it's a lot less of a concern, but it's still an issue if there might be other people in the room. So it's something you just want to talk about. People have been playing around with virtual backgrounds a lot over the last several months. There's also a lot of information out there about the proper dress wear for a mediation. Best practices, you know, things like don't wear a lot of messy patterns. Make sure that if you are using some kind of background that you wear clothing that's distinct from the background so that you can be seen relative to the background. Also make sure that you wear generally neutral colors, not very loud or bright colors so that it creates unnecessary problems with the camera and the lighting. But there are lots of things like this you can find online. And then with the participants, various video layout options. We talked about before gallery view and active speaker view and things like that, just so that the participants know that there are options, that they don't have to be stuck looking at the Brady Bunch screen, but they can also adjust their view so they can modify it as necessary or modify it to suit their comfort and needs. Let's talk a little bit about caucusing because obviously caucusing is going to be a big part of many mediations. And the ability to caucus really depends on the video teleconferencing platform that you're using. For example, Skype for Business, which the New Jersey Superior Courts are using right now, or Microsoft Teams, which is what the New York State Courts are using right now for their conferences with the judges, do not support separate rooms. So you really can't use them other than through disconnect and reconnect, which again is cumbersome, but possible. Zoom does have something called breakout rooms, but in order to do that and do that effectively, you have to remember that the free version of Zoom that everyone was able to get initially really is not going to be suitable for breakout rooms because it has a limit of 3 participants and also a limit of duration of only 40 minutes. If you upgrade to the next level of Zoom Pro will allow you to have up to 100 participants and an unlimited duration on your meeting. That should be more than enough for most mediations other than multi-party and huge, huge environmental bankruptcy cases. And even then, I'm not sure you're going to have more than 100 participants. But Zoom Pro is actually surprisingly affordable, and you probably aren't going to need more than that. There was a question earlier before about Zoom meeting platform versus Zoom webinar platform. Obviously, for mediations, you're going to want to use the Zoom meeting platform, which is what we're using today for this program. In a Zoom webinar platform, only the speaker would be shown, and you wouldn't be able to converse directly with other participants who are attending. So when you use video teleconferencing platforms and their sort of options for breakout rooms, it's really no different than if the mediator had assigned individuals to rooms across the hall or down the hall. It's just that people are assigned specifically into these rooms and are able to chat confidentially and no one else can hear them. There was a question also about whether or not participants can be assigned in advance, and the answer is yes, you can. The only difficulty is that, at least with Zoom, you need to know the email addresses of the participants in advance, and specifically the email address from which they're using to download the Zoom client or from where they're logging in. And because I don't always have that information, and because it's relatively easy to set up a breakout room even on the fly, I don't bother setting up breakout rooms in advance. Also, there's always the possibility that, particularly with the non-attorneys who are participating, that they will not be downloading the clients in advance. They're simply just using the link and using the browser. And if that's the situation, there won't be any ability to have assigned them previously in advance. Also, they may have given you a different email address for email address that they were going to download, but then later on, they're signing in using a different address. So that can get a little bit complicated. And so I'd rather just simply set up the breakout room at the moment when people have all joined the room. Next, I want to just cover sharing documents. Most VTC platforms do allow sharing of documents so that all the participants can visually view these documents. They can include documents arising from the underlying case, videos and PowerPoints, for photographs, you know, anything basically that you can have open on your desktop, you can basically share. And in Zoom, the meeting host, or the mediator in this case, can lock the screen sharing function so as to only allow the mediator to share or allow multiple participants to share. And in that regard, that's really helpful if people want to be able to interject. And this is the way in which, as I noted earlier, if you're going to be memorializing the mediation at the very end, sharing the document on the screen with everybody in the same room, this is the function that will allow you to do so. So in the time remaining, let's just talk a little bit about what the obvious benefits are of virtual mediation, and then some of the concerns that have arisen. The first and foremost is that, you know, there's no risk, no realistic risk to life and health. Obviously, if you're doing this virtually, and that's obviously of paramount importance in this pandemic era. More importantly, though, there are enormous savings in travel time and expenses for both out-of-town and local participants. Travel and lodging costs are essentially non-existent. The accompanying logistical issues of trying to coordinate, you know, flight and train schedules or weather delays and hotel availability, all of those are essentially eliminated. And also, if you had participants who always wanted to participate but were barred from doing so due to cost concerns, for example, like the associate on the case who really wanted to see a mediation, but due to cost concerns from the client, only the partner can go. Well, now if the firm is willing, the associate could attend virtually, and then the partner could hopefully write off the time, so there would be no cost to the client. So all those things are quite beneficial in the virtual setting. And lastly, scheduling is far easier because all we're talking about really is the date and time of the session. And more importantly, because virtual can be easily set up, it can accommodate sort of these time-sensitive disputes that can erupt, especially in this COVID-19 era where there are going to be a lot of issues arising, for example, between landlords and tenants, commercial contracts, all these expectations that we've had suddenly being thwarted, the employment context and labor context for sure. All of these may have some time sensitivity to them, and virtual mediation allows you to schedule them very quickly and lead to a faster resolution. But there are some concerns using the VTC platforms. I just want to go over a few of them in the closing minutes before we take questions. Obviously, first and foremost is the competency of the parties, the counsel, and the mediator in utilizing the platform both effectively and ethically. It requires some time to get used to, and much like in the arbitration context, a lot more of the burden generally tends to be on the neutral to be familiar with the features and the limitations of the platform, be able to explain that to all the participants, as well as the added sort of additional burden for the mediator, who has to not only think on his or her feet quickly, adjust to the dynamics in the room, be innovative and creative, and then on top of all that, also be facile with the technology, being able to put people in breakout rooms, being able to bring them back, facilitate discussion, react to things that are happening in the virtual environment. There's always platform security and privacy issues. I addressed some of those with the Zoom bombing issue, but password protection, locking of rooms, enabling waiting rooms, the lobby room, and removal of unwanted, a large number of of these sort of security and privacy can be eliminated with these kinds of adoption of these kinds of parameters. Also, recently, Zoom allows users to change the region through which their data is routed, because there was some concern that, for example, some of the data on the Zoom platforms are being routed through China, and there were some allegations that there was lack of trust, that the Chinese authorities were perhaps spying in on the content. So if you have concerns and you believe that your data is being routed through a region you don't want routed, then you can change that, and that would add some additional layer of security. There are always going to be technical challenges, glitches, bugs, outages. Again, this is a piece of software, so it's part and parcel of that. And we're reliant heavily on internet, and most of the world is now. So obviously, we're going to have to deal with that. But the good news is that everything I've mentioned above, competency, privacy, security, technical glitches, all of that can usually be overcome through training, education, and practice using the platform. It just takes some time, and there's some wonderful people out there. I mean, today is not a day for software training, but there are wonderful people out there who do training on these platforms on an in-depth level. Susan Guthrie, for example, Simon Baum, they run these virtual training sessions, either in a group or individually, and they can go through screen by screen. Some of the screenshots that Keith inserted in his PowerPoint, you'll see them and you'll be able to manipulate them. As part of the Garibaldian, I've actually created practice groups so that people can meet in small groups of 6 to 10 and share the host responsibilities and practice putting each other in the breakout room so that they can feel comfortable with the platform and also learn from each other, because as we all do this, we're going to learn different tricks, and software keeps changing and evolving. The Zoom that I knew before the pandemic is a very different Zoom than it is today. And I'm sure it'll be a very different Zoom going into the future. And as new versions of Zoom keep coming out, I think they're up at 5.0 now, there'll be new features and new limitations. And you'll want to be cognizant of those and share that information with others so that you can become more adept, facile, and comfortable with the platform. There is one other concern I want to mention, which is platform fatigue. It has to do with the concept that Keith introduced towards the end of his presentation about being tired on the platform. But lately, there have been far more articles and literature coming out that there are distortions and delays that are inherent in video communication. I mean, actually, we've all experienced them throughout the day on this program. And these delays and distortions can actually confound perception and muddle the social cues that we're used to seeing in person. In other words, the loss of eye contact or the disconnect or the difference between when my lips move, for example, and when you actually hear the sound. Our brains then struggle to fill in those gaps. And by trying to fill in those gaps, we're trying to make some sense of all of that disorder. But the problem is that we can't fully do so. And by not being satisfied, we feel disturbed, uneasy, tired, isolated, anxious, disconnected. And as you're going through the day on this platform, you're not really sure why that's happening, because it kind of operates on a subconscious level. You're not really aware. And participants over the course of a day in a mediation may find it very difficult to concentrate. They may find it difficult to establish rapport, empathy, trust, credibility. And this is for the mediator too. And these are all obviously critical things for a successful mediation to take place. So what to do? Here are some suggestions for how to deal with platform fatigue. First is to avoid multitasking while you're engaged in a session. Try and encourage people not to check their emails and look away from the screen and do other things while they're engaged in the mediation. Build in regular breaks from the screen. Obviously, you know, if the mediator's in one room and you're left alone in another room, that may be an opportunity for a natural time for a break. But the mediator, him or herself, it's one of the things I've learned over the course of my mediation career is to make sure that I take breaks for myself. And one of the things that's helpful is that if you exit a breakout room, you immediately go to the main room, where if you've set this up properly, no one else is there but you. You can just hang out there for a little while, recuperate, get your bearings, think through, maybe step away for a little bit from the screen, because the people in the other room don't know that you've done that. So you're not impeding the process in any way. And also, don't be afraid to stop the session early to prevent poor decision making and possible coercion. Remember that mediation is a self-determinative process. It wouldn't be appropriate for the mediator to lock the room, for example, and tell the parties not to. You can't leave until you settle. Or if a mediation was running to 2 a.m. in the morning to say, come on, we're almost there, we can finish it. You don't want to be in a situation where people are coerced into settling because they're so tired from participating in the process. So don't be afraid to stop the session and reconvene at a different time. You can reduce other on-screen stimuli. So that, again, closing all your other applications and the like. Switching also to a phone call or an email instead of a video. Stopping all the video may be a good way to continue if you want to do that. Also, and this goes in with my recommendation to consider stopping the session early, is if you note that if you think that this is going to be a real possibility, one thing I always do now in the pre-mediation conference calls is to suggest to the parties, explain to them a little bit about platform fatigue. And I suggest to them that maybe we should set aside 2 separate days, and that possibly the first day will only go for a few hours because we don't know what that session is going to be like. We have a backup second day that we can continue if for some reason we need to end early. And that could happen, for example, in the situation where you have an internet disconnect problem and you need to suspend the mediation. So it's always good to have sort of a backup date, and then you can sort of see how it goes and judge whether or not people are, yeah.
Hey, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm getting the notation. Some people may be a little bit fatigued. Would you mind if you just wrap up? Because we would like to give people a 5-minute break, and then we could come back and all get together and hopefully handle people's questions.
Yeah, actually, I'm on my last slide. I'm going to finish up in like 10 seconds.
Sorry about that.
So here I'll stop. Thanks, Jonathan. So no one is advocating that virtual mediations are exactly the same or is perfect replacement for an in-person mediation session. But at the same time, no one really knows where we're going with this pandemic and how it's going to evolve and adapt over time, especially as New Jersey opens up or the country opens up. And whether we'll ever return back to something that we call normal or now we're in a new normal, that remains to be seen. What is clear is the pandemic has served as a real catalyst for ADR processes in the virtual world. And so with courts that are not fully operational right now, this is a tremendous opportunity for all of us in the ADR space to look at virtual mediation to resolve disputes, add to our practicing toolbox. So I encourage you to take a look at it, take some more training, and try it out, because I think you'll find it's pleasantly not as difficult as it may seem. So let me stop there, Jonathan. Thank you so much for the cue.
You're welcome. And Theo, I'm not sure if anybody was experiencing this, but there was a little bit of sort of technical difficulties on your end. I don't know if they were all internet related or what that was.
It could be, and I apologize for that. Again, it's like I said before, it could simply be because having bandwidth problems around the neighborhood, or my kids are playing too many games. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay. If there's anything you could do to fix it during the break, that'd be great. Otherwise, what we'll do is, why don't we take a break until 5 minutes after the next hour, which on the East Coast is 4 o'clock. And at 4:05, we'll all jump back on and do about 55 minutes of the ethics session together. So why don't we do that? And if anybody needs to sign out and sign back in to improve their audio, we can do that and take care of that when we return. Thank you. Oh, it's 5 minutes after. So if everyone's back, why don't we put in our CLE cue, which I'm going to change to mediate to win. Mediate, Theo space WIN. If everybody could type that in, then we'll know that you were here. If anyone missed this message and they see their screen and it doesn't have their name on it, has something else like their phone number, the union they belong to, whatever it is, you can click again in your top right hand side of the box. There's 3 dots. You could click rename, and in there you should be able to change your name. So do we have Theo, and do we have Keith, and do we have James, and do we have Brady?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Okay. All right.
I'm here.
So Theo.
Here. Yep.
All right. And Emily, are you there? Or Bernadette? Well, I assume we're still recording. Bernadette, we're recording, right?
The recording.
Never turned off. Okay. So we're going to get started now with the final portion. This is generally concerning ethics, but it's also going to be generally concerning anything that concerns you folks. I actually, when Theo was saying cons as concerns, I never made that connection before. Is that what con stands for, concerns? Probably so, huh? Maybe? No, maybe not. I don't know. In any event, I'll lead off with an interesting opinion from the National Academy of Arbitrators that was sent to my attention a few times relative to this matter. And all of these things, by the way, should be in our brochure, are in our brochure for continuing legal education purposes that you can get from the National LIRA website. If you have any questions about how to do that, please ask Bernadette or Emily, because I probably won't be able to help you very much. I'll just tell you to ask Bernadette or Emily. So why don't we talk a little bit, and I'm gonna probably start with Keith to basically tell us what it is, but the question that was posed to the National Academy of Arbitrators, I believe, was, is there ever an exception in light of the COVID pandemic now by which an arbitrator can override the objections of one or both parties, I guess, to an arbitration and say, we are going to do this arbitration using video conferencing? Is that essentially what the question was, Keith?
The question is, it's close. It's a little bit different. It's specifically, can an arbitrator order that a matter proceed by way of a video hearing at the request of one party over the objection of the other party to the arbitration? So it's a little different because if both parties say we don't want to go forward via video, well then that's a really easy answer. That case doesn't go forward via video. It's the party's process.
That's like the same way we're testing the audience. I was testing to see how well you knew the rule. So what did they find? What did they say?
Well, so
who is it, by the way? You're a member of the National Academy. Who issues this kind of thing?
This is from the Committee on Professional Responsibility and Grievances. And this is an advisory opinion to the Code of Professional Responsibility promulgated by the National Academy, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, and the American Arbitration Association.
So before you go on, I'm just a little bit interested. We have a lot of arbitrators on here that might know what that means. But to what extent, do arbitrators have to adhere to certain ethical guidelines, and to what extent is the National Academy of Arbitrators opinions something that need to be followed by all arbitrators or arbitrators who are a member of the Academy?
So arbitrators who are members of the Academy are subject to the code. Those who take cases under the auspices of the American Arbitration Association or the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service are also bound to follow the code. And so these are, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, so if you're not, let's say I just happen to be an arbitrator in New Jersey, I'm not a member of the National Academy. They've been sitting on my application for some reason. And certainly the advisory opinion would at least be evidentiary or guiding in some way, wouldn't it?
I would think so. A number of other parties, sometimes in their contracts or other appointing agencies, also indicate the requirement that the arbitrators they use, the arbitrators who are members of the panel or roster, have to abide by the code in the same way. And so it's not limited only to Academy members. So this is an advisory opinion to that code based on the committee's interpretation of the obligations under the code. And so the opinion, and you all have it in the materials if you haven't seen it already, recognizes the voluntary nature of labor arbitration, the principles of mutual consent, and sort of the underpinnings of the labor arbitration process. And it recognizes the obligation of the arbitrator to provide a fair and adequate hearing, which assures that both parties have sufficient opportunity to present their respective evidence and argument. And there's also an obligation that arbitrators have under the code to provide effective service to the parties. So it goes on to note that, there may be parties who have agreed either on an ad hoc basis, say on this case, we don't want to use video, or on more of a blanket basis, right, in their contracts or in a side letter or otherwise, that we don't want video hearings as part of our process. And again, that's easy in the sense that if you don't, if you have agreement that that's not what's going to happen, then that's not what's going to happen for those parties. The more difficult situation is where there's no such agreement and where one party is interested in moving forward via video and the other is not. And that's the situation that the advisory opinion is dealing with. And it was certainly prompted by the pandemic. I think it has broader application. It's not just under these circumstances, though the circumstances of the pandemic are certainly something that I think the parties and the arbitrator are going to be considering in determining what to do. And so what's really encouraged is for the arbitrator to put on at least their facilitator hat, if not their mediator hat, and talk with the parties about the case and about the concerns that each party has, and to get a handle on, is there something, where are you coming from on this, each of you, and are there things we can do to address concerns you may have, to address unique aspects of the particular case, and to try and reach agreement on ground rules, sort of like you all have seen over the course of the day. They list a number of the opinion lists a number of considerations, like a global pandemic, for example, the impact on the health and safety of the participants. Is the matter time sensitive? Is there continuing liability? Are there restrictions on travel? Are there family and health considerations of counsel or a witness? Does a party not have the necessary equipment? Is it difficult to prepare and marshal witnesses over video? Are there other limiting considerations like that? Is the nature of the grievance, the nature of the dispute, something that lends itself or really doesn't to proceeding via video? And these are the sorts of considerations that the opinion lays out. And ultimately, the opinion contemplates that an arbitrator may proceed via video over the objection of a party, but that's going to be a case-by-case analysis and an individualized determination. And I'll refrain from paraphrasing. It's there for everybody to read.
I'm a paraphraser, so let's say in 2 sentences, the question is, can an arbitrator order that a matter proceed by way of video hearing at the request of one party over the objection of the other party to the arbitration? And the answer, as far as I can glean, is yes, but you better have a pretty good reason for it, and you better be able to explain yourself for doing
Jonathan,
so.
do you mind if I weigh in a little bit on this?
No, I would appreciate it if you would.
Sure. So, I mean, from the union's perspective, when you have a grievance and an arbitration provision in a contract, that's a mutually agreed upon and negotiated term and condition of that contract. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I take great issue with this advisory opinion. I think that, and actually the opinion in the second paragraph says, voluntary arbitration rests upon the mutual desire of the parties. So if one party is objecting, I would take great issue with an arbitrator requiring the parties to submit to a video conference arbitration. The whole concept of arbitration, where it has been agreed upon by the parties, that takes mutual assent, a meeting of the minds. And if the parties don't have a meeting of the minds to proceed by way of video conference, I don't think that this advisory opinion follows the spirit of that agreement. Also, just concerning there being language in a CBA or a CNA, one that is currently in effect most likely is not going to have that kind of language in there. We may start seeing that, but I don't, I can't even tell you how many contracts that I have seen and looked at, and not one has that kind of a provision in there. It's kind of a new concept as far in the world that I work in, but we may start seeing that being a part of the negotiation process.
This is why having a smart panel is both a blessing and a curse, because I can get to point out pithy things and then move on. Because I was just going to say that in the fourth paragraph, first sentence, which I think Brady is alluding to, it says, in the absence of a collective bargaining agreement or ad hoc agreement of the parties prohibiting such an arrangement. So basically what I believe is being stated outright explicitly is that this doesn't apply obviously if you've got a prohibition in a contract. But like Brady said, right now, probably almost no collective bargaining agreements or collective negotiation agreements, which is the parlance of the public sector in New Jersey at least, would they have possibly contemplated, hey, look, let's put something in there that that the arbitration will not be conducted virtually or remotely without the agreement of both parties. James, would you negotiate for that kind of a provision, or would you fight a union at the table if they wanted to put that in, or would you use that as concessionary bargaining and get something better in for your client?
So, I think it depends on the client and the situation and the relationship. But again, my default position is, I'd rather have an in-person labor arbitration at this point in time. So, I don't think Brady and I would have much of a dispute here. Perhaps there's a way, yes, I would consider adding language that would permit it in maybe limited circumstances, or just generally, provided that the parties mutually agree to it, including that type of language in there. One thing that I wanted to mention here, you had talked about earlier, like the possible vacatur of a arbitration decision based on improper circumstances. I think that this could open the door for that type of motion. And in particular, the advisory opinion, I believe, mentions or suggests that a telephonic hearing is also on the table. And there was a recent National Labor Relations Board decision where a regional director allowed our case, election case hearing to move forward telephonically, which involved examination of a witness. And the board in Washington, D.C. reversed that decision by the regional director, although they were okay with the idea of a remote hearing. The idea that a witness, you have to have the right to confront them face to face, which would include video, was important to them. So, I think arbitrators, particularly if they're open to the concept of insisting upon a telephonic hearing, are risking the opportunity that a motion is going to be made to vacate that decision. And I think there's decent grounds for prevailing in that type of case.
Can I make just two quick comments?
Yeah, I was going to go to you, Theo. I wanted to hear if you were outraged. But first, tell us, are you a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators?
I am not.
Okay.
So I did want to point out that, like in other contexts, like for example the commercial context, usually there's a lot of gamesmanship going on, which may or may not happen in the labor context, where delay is usually used by one party or the other to gain an advantage. And so these motions where one party wants to go forward with a virtual, but one party does not, are actually coming up more and more in the commercial context. And arbitrators don't have the advisory opinion that, that Keith alluded to. So they've been relying heavily on the AAA's rules or the provided rules, which basically leave a lot of the discretion as to whether hearings go forward and how they go forward in the hands of the arbitrator. But I'll echo what Keith said. And it's exactly what I love this advisory opinion, because it lays forth factors that should be considered. And it's very important that the arbitrator engage the parties in a robust discussion about these issues and the concerns on either side. Because, and this dovetails to what James just said, these arbitrator final awards are going to be subject to vacator petitions. And under 10A3, a final award could be vacated if an arbitrator refuses to postpone a hearing when sufficient good cause has been shown. And so the issue then is, were sufficient good cause reasons established by the parties before the arbitrator. And if not, then the arbitrator, at least under the commercial rules, would be well within her or his discretion to permit the arbitration to go forward virtually, even over the objection of the other party.
Well, it's interesting you used the words good cause, Theo, and relative to this particular opinion, to get to James' point about possible vacation motion down the line, the standard that I see, at least in the paragraph that I just read, the fourth paragraph about in the absence of a collective bargaining agreement, it says an arbitrator in exceptional circumstances. So perhaps the burden that would be on the party defending the arbitration award on appeal that they would have to establish is that there were exceptional circumstances justifying the arbitrator's decision to proceed, notwithstanding the strenuous objection of one party. So what would meet the exceptional circumstances? I mean, let's say that there's another outbreak of COVID and we're locked down for another 5 months, God forbid, right? And there's an issue that just needs to be decided. Maybe it's even about work rules and it's about wearing a mask, let's say, and the union's refusing to cooperate with it. It could be a public health safety risk. Maybe that's the type of situation. So Theo loves it. Other people are outraged by it. I guess we're probably not going to resolve it today.
Well, let me circle back to a couple of things. First, that the question that's posed is, can an arbitrator order? Should an arbitrator order is a really different question.
Right.
And I wasn't privy to the discussions that generated the opinion, so I can't shed any light there. But, it strikes me that this opinion is an incentive for parties to cooperate where possible, because it says somewhere down the line at some point, if one party is in favor of this and the other is engaging in gamesmanship, to use Theo's words, that the arbitrator may be able to take some action, may find it appropriate to take some action, determining that a video hearing is necessary in order to provide a fair and effective hearing. And let's not get to that point if we can avoid it.
Right. So obviously you always want labor relations, as James said earlier in the program. You want, the union and management to be able to agree on things as basic as whether to have a virtual arbitration or not. So this is really a worst case scenario, nuclear option, so to speak, whereby an arbitrator has no choice but to make a ruling because the parties have basically given him or her no choice to do so. Let's move on to some other concerns in the arbitration.
One very quick point there is just practically speaking, an arbitrator who's going to pull the trigger there does obviously risk being struck from the list of the parties agreed upon arbitrators. Pretty, that's a good way to get kicked off a list. So just practically a consideration to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's a good way to not get picked by that attorney again. That's for sure, right? So why don't we look back at the mock arbitration for a minute, and then I'd also like to go into Theo's presentation and talk about some of the ethical things that could come for lawyers.
Jonathan, can I add one thing on there, though? And I recognize the point that James has made, though I think for all of us as arbitrators, we understand that's one of the risks of the profession, and and not with this in particular, this I agree is the rare circumstance, but you decide every case like it's your last. And you make the call that you make based on what you think based on your judgment and based on the contract and based on the party's practice and the record. And if that costs you the next case, that's life in the fast lane. But I do recognize the practical implications there, but I don't think that's how most of us make our decisions.
Right. Well, certainly when you're a big shot Zoom arbitrator taking all the work, you don't have to worry about whether attorneys are going to start striking you from the list. I'm just joking, Keith, but you're doing a great job. So let's talk about the mock arbitration. There was a segment where Lucille, better known as Lou Baker from her theatrical role therein, had a sidebar discussion with James. And, the two of them are on camera, on recording, at least for our purposes, having what was attorney-client legal discussion. What, I guess I'd like to hear from the attorneys, the practicing attorneys first, you're all attorneys. what concerns do you have about the fact that that discussion was done on screen, whether or not it's recorded? Why don't you start with you, James, and then go to Brady?
Sure. And no matter how many assurances I get, obviously we did that for purposes of this mock proceeding, but no matter how many assurances I get, I would never have that discussion over this type of platform. What I would do is make sure we moved each of us respectively into a separate room, got on the phone and had a discussion. One, it's just that element of control and trust generally it makes you feel more comfortable. In addition, I think that there are legitimate concerns that there could be a potential breach. Obviously, as an attorney, you have an obligation to safeguard your client's confidential information and in your conversations as well. If for whatever reason, someone was recording that meeting, I think there's a chance that, the platform, Zoom in that instance, and Keith would know better than me, but I think that, it's realistic to think that they may, depending on your settings, have now control of that recording in that video. And that in and of itself, arguably, is a breach of the privilege. And if somebody ever subpoenaed, for example, Zoom for a copy of that conversation, they may have to turn that over. So I think that there are, it's a very good question. And I think it's something that attorneys need to take very seriously. And for that reason, it's, something at this point in time, I would never feel comfortable having those types of conversations over this type of platform, despite assurances.
Before Brady responds, why don't you answer that question, Keith, since you're kind of a resident expert about what Zoom does and doesn't do, even though Theo also is too. Let's say that sidebar were not part of the video recording, or were it? I mean, would it be? I mean, you've got a breakout room. You're recording the main hearing, so it probably wouldn't be part of the recording. Is that true?
So it depends. If you're doing a cloud recording where the video file lives, for lack of a better word, on Zoom servers when you're done, that doesn't record the breakout rooms. I usually use a local recording for some of the reasons James just mentioned. I'd rather not have the recording go up there that way, even though I think that the odds of it being an issue are pretty minimal. But when you do a local recording on Zoom, the camera follows the person doing the recording. So if I was doing a local recording and I went into the breakout room, say for a sidebar, and or to check in for a moment, or a sidebar with both attorneys, which is the much more likely way it happens, and I don't remember to turn that off, my recording is going to have our sidebar on it. Now, my meeting settings have this booming voice that'll tell you that this meeting is now being recorded. And so if I actually came into the breakout room with it on, I expect I'm going to be really embarrassed and I'll quickly turn that off, or one of the attorneys are going to say, Mr. Arbitrator, what the heck are you doing? Knock it off, turn that recording off before we say anything else, and we'll take care of it that way. But that's, if you're using the local recording, which is a way to avoid some of the issues that James raised, that's one of the new issues that kind of pops up. And I'll add that the suggestion to caucus kind of over the phone and separately is something I've seen an awful lot, and it makes sense for a lot of parties. And it's one of those things, just talk about it at the front end so that everyone understands that's what they're going to need to do, and equip everyone on their teams appropriately for that, rather than having it come up last minute and saying, oh, I don't want to use these breakout rooms, but how else can I do this?
So just to be 100% clear, for those of us who aren't as conversant in the technology, let's say that you were doing a Zoom arbitration, just like the one we saw this morning. You were recording it locally. You put James and Lucille, or Lou Baker, in a breakout room, and they had this discussion regarding what questions James was going to ask the grievant. Would that, if you were not in that room, and at that point it's just James and Lou, is it not being recorded by you?
Under those circumstances, my recording will not have their conversation.
But if you were to jump in and see what's taking them so long, or see if they're okay, that it would record that portion of it.
If I were doing a local recording and I left it running when I joined the breakout room, my recording would get at least the start of that conversation until they yelled at me to turn it off.
And as far as you know, if you're doing a local recording, Zoom would not have Zoom like wouldn't have any kind of omniscient presence whereby it could itself have some ownership rights or recording of James' conversation with Lou.
If it's a local recording, the recording will stay on my hard drive, as I understand it. What Zoom can or can't do in the context of the meeting itself may be a different issue depending on their privacy policy and everything else. And my understanding is that they have some ability not to listen in so much as to coordinate the different streams, so that, and that's part of how I think they make dial-in via phone work in the context of the hearings or the meetings.
Not this, yeah.
Sorry, just to chime in, and I want to make sure that I'm clear and that everybody else is clear. And I think this is part of why having an arbitrator who is conversant in whatever platform you're using is so important. And Keith, this is kind of a question for you. Does the arbitrator have the ability to disable other users' ability to make local recordings?
Yes, using the software,
Okay.
but nothing, prevents someone from holding up their phone, right, or just having it off to the side and getting the audio. But I can, as a host, I can prevent others from making local recordings or cloud recordings without my permission.
Okay.
So the only concern from a local recording level of James' conversation with Lou would be theoretically that Zoom may be some kind of a third party involved, and therefore there's someone besides the attorney and client present, and it would be Zoom, although that might be a pretty attenuated argument to pierce the attorney-client privilege, I would think. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think it's pretty unlikely, but Theo, you may know the technology, the back-end piece of it better than I do.
It's not so much that I know the technology, but it's an issue actually I've been thinking about, because Zoom initially had claimed that it was end-to-end encryption, but then we know that's not true. End-to-end means that it doesn't have any idea what's going on between the communication. But it must know something, because as Keith said earlier, it has to be able to navigate the streams that are being issued. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to switch between active speakers. It has to know that I'm speaking right now, as opposed to Brady or Jonathan. And so there is some sort of encryption, but I think the notion is that Zoom is not listening to the content, is my understanding. But I think the argument is still open, whether or not, because Zoom is still a passive, somewhat listener on that private conversation, have you somehow broken the attorney-client privilege? I don't know if it's attenuated or not. I just don't think it's been fleshed out.
It seems to me, as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, that because the client would have no knowledge of Zoom intruding, and it's the client's privilege to waive, that the attorney-client privilege should be strong enough that the client can say that they had an expectation of privacy during that conversation, and that, if there was an incidental overhearing of it by some, corporate monolith like Zoom, that shouldn't pierce or make them, have a partial or a complete waiver of the attorney-client privilege. What do you think, Brady?
Well, what I was going to say is that, again, really the way to avoid a lot of this is to, in the ground rules, provide for a different mechanism by not doing those local caucuses. If people are truly concerned, and so many of us are, I cover my camera when I'm not using it. I just don't like the idea of anyone ever being able to access what's going on in my house. I have children, you don't know what somebody could see. So I think that's really the way to get around it, if people are not comfortable with it. I tend to agree. It's the parties, it's the advocates and the clients, with the client's input, who are agreeing to conducting an arbitration by video conferencing. So, I don't know. I think the jury is probably still out on that, but I think it's safer to provide in the ground rules for a different mechanism for engaging in those attorney-client conversations.
Not to send things spinning too far out of the orbit, but what's the difference between that and me sending on Gmail an attorney-client communication to a client? We all know that Google pretty much knows what color socks I'm wearing right now. So, is that somehow a safer venue to exchange attorney-client information than Zoom? And I don't think we should answer that. I think we should probably move on to other things.
Let me
Let
just
me-
bring up
oh,
one other
James.
point real quick. There is another layer too, which is similar to what you're referring to, Jonathan, but we all have our internet routers or servers in our house where we connect to the internet. They should be password protected, right? Because they could, if they get hacked into, I don't know who's going to do it, but somebody could theoretically do that. And then again, you have a breach, and you don't want to be standing before a disciplinary board where they're saying, well, did you password protect your internet? And your answer is no. I mean, did you then, breach your duty to competently know how to use the technology, for example? And one practical tip there might be to, on a regular basis while we're working remotely, to reset our passwords on occasion, including with the internet.
Charlie Cash made an interesting comment that he says that there's software you can buy that's undetected by Zoom that just records everything on your computer. I think there's also less advanced technology in a way that I could probably just take my iPhone, right, and just record what's going on also. So he makes that comment, yeah.
But again, I mean, I think that if there's a concern about surreptitious recording, maybe that gets incorporated into your ground rules from the very beginning, right? I mean, no surreptitious recordings of the proceedings in any way. And then, and maybe you incorporate provisions regarding the way that the parties expect that the attorney-client privilege to be provided for during the proceedings. I mean, those are all things that need to be addressed in that pre-arbitration or pre-hearing conference.
I got another comment from Jeff Bezos from Amazon saying that they like my socks, and the answer is yes, I would like more, Mr. Bezos. Thank you. Please send me some advertisements.
Let me add one. Oh, Theo, go ahead.
Before, when I mentioned that there's screen capturing software that's out there, that's how people used to rip songs off the radio, or off the computer, I should say. When you're streaming music, you can capture that stream just like you can capture this video or audio stream, and so that's why in the mediation context, for example, I always have the parties agree up front that they're not going to record, and not going to record in any other way. Like, in other words, turning on their iPhone or turning on screen capture software. Whether they follow it or not, I mean, that's, you got to hope that people are exercising good faith and are going to abide by the agreements they reach. But Brady's point is correct. You should handle these things right up front as part of the pre-arbitration conference or the pre-mediation conference, so that people know what the ground rules are.
Right, and if you want to act with an abundance of caution, I think counsel has already said that you just you handle things offline in ways that you're more comfortable. Telephone, email, I guess probably telephone, right? Or in person if you're in the same place as James was with Lou. Maybe the two of them could have just walked out in a hallway, maintained a 6-foot distance from each other, put their masks back on, and
Could
have
also
a little conversation.
become fluent in Morse code, which could be another.
There you go.
Well, let me note a couple of things. First, one of the joys of labor arbitration is that you're working with parties who are in a collective bargaining relationship. And so they hopefully have some trust. They're certainly going to have to deal with each other tomorrow without me. And the fact that you have that ongoing relationship means that hopefully the repeat players in the process, and I mean that in the best way, the union and the company, or the union and the employer, aren't going to mess around like that, because they know that it's going to poison the well the next day or the next week or the next month if someone finds out about that. And so the other piece on the more technical end, though, is as of Saturday, I think, Zoom has enabled as an option the end-to-end encryption that Theo was talking about. But there's a balance. If you turn it on, nobody can call into the meeting. And so you end up in this with this tension between, do you want to make your hearing more accessible if someone loses their connection or their computer audio isn't good, or it's a witness who everyone's okay taking via telephone, on a one-off exception basis, at the risk of reducing your encryption a little bit, and maybe more than a little bit. I don't mean to minimize or maximize it. So it's something else for parties to think about, where the priorities are and where the right balance is for that particular case and their particular relationship and industry sometimes.
It bears noting there's some interesting commenting going on right now that was initiated by Armando Riccio, who's one of New Jersey's finest management side attorneys, although he only just joined New Jersey Lira, believe it or not, as a result of this conference, which is regrettable, mentioning the implication of the wiretapping laws. And obviously those do vary from state to state. I think in many states, are one party states, meaning I think that's what New Jersey is, meaning that as long as you're one of the parties on the conversation, you're permitted to record. But what happens if you're recording something where you're not one of the parties? That would be against the law. Other parties are two-party consent state, or everybody has to consent state. So you should probably consult your state laws to see if what you're doing is legal. And then, I don't know, Theo, you're a big attorney. Before you were a mediator, you might even know the answer to this. What happens if you're in a multi-state situation where you've got parties in various states? So that it could get even more complicated at that point.
I can't even begin to answer that question.
Yeah. So anyway, I did want to move into a mediation context, if everybody's okay with that. So I was doing a mediation, and the mediator was breaking us out into all of these sidebar conversations. And there were multiple parties to the mediation. So actually my client was being sued, and so was a co-defendant, and they both had separate counsel. So we were all together in this sidebar, and the mediator would sometimes come in, sometimes not come in. But the lawyers are walking around their office, leaving their office sometimes. And I was uncomfortable because, as we all know, under the model rules in New Jersey, or the ABA, it's 433, I think, you're not allowed to talk as an attorney to a represented party. That, I would be in a situation on Zoom where here I am sitting there, the other person's attorney just wandered out of the room ostensibly, unless he's just somewhere off camera. And now, I better switch the subject to, the weather pretty quick, or else I'm talking potentially to a represented party. So what do you think about that, Theo? Ways to prevent, yeah.
I honestly think that's more honored in the breach. I mean, that happens in-person mediations all the time, right? I mean, a counsel leaves to go to the bathroom, leaves the client in the room, and now I don't think I've never had a situation where the attorney was really all that worried, and they just simply don't talk about the case or talk to the person about the matters that are in dispute. So I don't, in the case of a virtual mediation, if you really wanted to avoid that situation, you would simply exit yourself from the private room that you're in, and just take yourself out of the equation until you know that, and peek back in and make sure to see if the other side's attorney has come in, and then you come back.
So basically you just apply the same common sense you would in real life to the virtual setting?
Basically, yeah. I mean, I think there are very salient differences between in-person and virtual. But I try and make the analogy and try and remember that, if we acted a certain way in the in-person context, then think about how that would work out in the virtual context. And I'll just give you a quick example. Like somebody said to me, they were so worried about people listening in on the Zoom mediations, they couldn't maintain confidentiality. I said, how many times have you been to the other side's offices for a mediation? Did you go in there and sweep for bugs before you went into the mediation room? Probably not. So, yes, is it a possibility? Of course it's a possibility if you want to dream up things, but you got to sort of exercise some common sense and decide whether or not it's that important to you. But let me not minimize it. If it is important to you, then you should raise it and you should talk about it and then figure out a way around it that makes sense for you.
What about the Lou Baker James situation? If that were in a mediation where you had set ground rules about confidentiality, would you feel more comfortable about that happening online than in an arbitration, or is it really no difference?
Well, I think yes. I mean, obviously, I would in my welcoming remarks have a very lengthy, there's a little portion that I talk about confidentiality, how important it is in a mediation setting. And in that situation, if for some reason Lou really had to be out of the mediation setting, I wouldn't have sort of left her camera on. I would have excluded her into a waiting room for sure, much like what we talked about earlier during the session with Brady and James. Or I would have asked her to just disconnect, and I would have texted her to call back in when we were ready for her, so that there wouldn't even be that. I would just avoid the whole situation by presenting those possibilities.
Well, because mediation, is a lot different than an arbitration, which arbitration is a lot of action, right? Whereas mediation, depending on the number of parties, the mediator is jumping around, and the parties are kind of sitting there waiting for the mediator to come back in the room, waiting for the next volley, what they're going to throw out the other side. That's all attorney-client privilege. So if I'm following the James Lou arbitration rule, where we're going to talk on the telephone, then basically we're going to be signed off or muted 90% of the time that we're on the Zoom call, because we're on the telephone the whole time, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And that's why I indicated earlier, I mean, I do a lot of telephone mediations, and you could do the exact same thing on Zoom, right? If you anticipate being with one side for quite some period of time, let's say 45 minutes or an hour, and you know that in advance, you can tell the other parties, look, feel free to disconnect. I'll let you know when you can come back in, because there's no reason for you to hang out in the platform if you know I'm going to be way late for an hour or so. And this sort of disconnect, reconnect, it sounds cumbersome, but in fact, it's actually not that big a deal. I do this all the time in telephone mediations, and it works out perfectly fine. You just have to set expectations and just manage the parties' expectations about when you're going to be coming back. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll check in. I'll just say, I'll text you 20, 30 minutes in and let you know that whether I'm still with them or not, and whether I'll need you sooner, right? Otherwise, why don't you plan on dialing back in at 3 o'clock, and we'll be ready to go at 3.
Are there any other ethical, specifically ethical issues that any of the presenters want to talk about? I know I kind of skipped you, Brady. I wanted to hear from you specifically, but anything else on that before we kind of open it up to more general Q&A?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, as an advocate, you want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to represent your client, and giving them the opportunity to present their side of the story. And I think what it comes down to is we need to make sure that this platform is appropriate. And I think that goes to the very function of who we are as advocates, and whether or not we can deliver that via this platform. And that, you know, I think that requires ethical considerations, and it requires an in-depth look at both the arbitrator, the facts of the case, the law surrounding the case, the parties, you know, labor relations, because it's not always harmonious. And, you know, the relationship between counsel. You know, there was a question asked regarding if counsel's talking over each other. And James and I, again, we talked about this before. You know, we were trying to talk over each other a little bit so that you could see, is that recorded? Is that going to be accurately transcribed? Those are all issues. You know, is the record clear? Those are all issues that I think we need to consider when we're determining whether or not to go forward. I think these all play in to each other.
I'll tell you some concerns that I have about the virtual setting for both mediation and arbitration, and I'd kind of like to hear from everybody on this. And also, if the audience could start typing in questions if they have them, that there will be a difference in mediation because people have an incentive to leave. So if you're having a mediation in person, and I have to get my client to get in their car and drive to Princeton Junction to Theo's office, I feel, and as the attorney, I'm always preaching mediation, right? I say, come on, guys, let's stay a little longer. We've been here for 5 hours. So to what extent is that aspect of real life mediation lost? Because, you know, I'm in my house, I'm at my office, I could just sign off. You know, I get my 2 free hours under the court rule, fine, peace, I'll see you later, and sayonara, right? And I don't have that in-person stake. I've been here. You know, I've been sitting in this office. Let's get a deal done before the end of the night and just get it hashed out. I saw, Theo, you nodded your head. Is that something that you think is real?
That's definitely a drawback. It's very easy to leave a mediation. Simply, it's so easy, right? You can simply just disconnect, turn off the computer, and you're done. You don't have to get in the car and drive an hour back home or something like that. It's one of the drawbacks of doing a virtual mediation. You know, that's sort of the flip side of saving all the money and time and expense. But you know, I think that's partly why it's important for the mediator to be cognizant of the parties' engagement in the process, to not leave them hanging out there in that breakout room for too long. I mean, my practice usually is to try and make sure I check in with them every 20, 30 minutes, some way, so that they're not left alone to their own devices. And that gets even worse as the hour goes on, right? As you know, in a typical mediation in person, you know, the so-called witching hour that mediators always point to is the 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock time period where magic happens. You know, in that situation, by then, if they've been on Zoom for like 6, 7 hours, this may be a real problem to try and keep them there. And I think you have to think of ways to engage them to make sure that they don't simply say, you know, I'm done. I'm just going to go have dinner with family now. Forget it. I'm done for today. And
It's
that's
almost
why
the
you don't be inhibited in stopping the session early to reconvene.
it's almost the opposite, right? Yeah, Brady.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, I think that has to do also with, and it really speaks to knowing your client, and knowing what kind of person or organization the client is, because a video conference mediation may work very well with a certain kind of client, but there may be some individuals that just really need that face-to-face. I don't know if it's pressure that the mediator can put on, but there is a certain degree of that. You know, showing what the different sides are, and the pluses and minuses and weaknesses, and benefits of settling the matter. So, you know, I really think that, you know, everybody can tell Theo's really skilled at mediation, and he does a lot of these by teleconference or by video conference, and he can probably tell by the parties, in assessing the parties, you know, whether things are going to work out. Maybe he can't, but I think as an advocate in going into a mediation, I think it's really important to know your client, and that's not going to be 100% foolproof, but I think that, you know, you need to be sensitive to those issues in going into a mediation.
Let's talk about arbitration for a second. What I've seen so far, just in my partner's experience now on the 9th day of this arbitration, is that there may be a tendency, maybe I'm wrong, that people feel like they can spend more time than they would in person, asking questions, preparing, taking breaks, calling witnesses, because it's easier to get witnesses, right? You don't need to necessarily ferret them out of wherever they are, clear their schedule the same way. And maybe you just feel a little bit more relaxed in the Zoom setting because you're in a comfortable environment, and you just talk a little bit more, you ask questions a little bit more, you take breaks a little bit more, and the thing just drags on a little bit more. Does anybody agree or disagree with that? Keith, you look like you disagree.
I don't know that I've seen it happen that way. I think the Zoom hearing days take longer because there's more that you have to manage, and, you know, just flipping through a new exhibit is a little bit more of a production. You've got to email it, you've got to wait for the other folks to get it, give them time to look at it, say, well, what's this on this page? Or what page are you talking about, right? Unless you've really gone through and made sure everything's got a clearly identifiable page number. I think you get some Zoom fatigue, right? Like the way Theo talked about, it's a lot of time to be kind of staring and looking into the screen. I think it's really stressful, especially for someone who's doing this for the first couple of times. And so I think you take some additional breaks because of that. I was working with a lawyer who, you know, I have a lot of respect for and has been doing this a long time. And they had a lot of trouble just getting things running, and it affected kind of the tenor of the day. And so I tried to make sure that they had additional breaks, you know, in an appropriate way. So do you want to take 10? And the other side was fine too. They'd been through the same thing a few weeks back. But it's a lot to manage, litigating a case and managing the technology at the same time. And that, I think, is something that we all need to acknowledge and kind of make allowance for. So I haven't seen as much of the, I'm going to keep doing this because I'm easy, you know, because it's easy to get, you know, to keep asking questions or get a hold of the witness. I haven't seen that prolong the day. It's more the sort of the adjustment.
And I have to say, you know, speaking personally, you know, I'm a working mother. I have kids who are doing remote schooling, and doing a Zoom arbitration from my home, that's a whole extra added layer of stress, because you can see the door behind me. I don't know who's going to walk through that door at any moment. So, you know, people are being pulled in a lot of different directions. And so those are all considerations that I think people need to take into account, especially where there is Zoom fatigue or platform fatigue, and things might go a little bit longer. You know, as things relax a little bit more and open up, people may be able to go into their offices, specifically if schools are closed. You know, I don't know that we all know how this is going to play out. So I think that as a working parent, I know many attorneys are working parents. So that's an extra layer of stress that does get added onto this whole process.
Alira, we're always interested in the future of where things are headed. So I'm going to ask James a question, because I know, James, you worked previously at Jackson Lewis, which is, we all know, is a national labor firm that kind of became national, I think, the same way as Lillard Mendelsohn and many of the others, by just kind of buying up these colony offices in various states, as opposed to Gibbons, which is, a regional powerhouse. But, I worked at Abraziz and McDermott in New Jersey, which was, probably in the 80s, before all the national buy mergers were going on. They could have represented any Fortune 50 company in New Jersey and no one would bat an eye. That's less likely to happen now. So what about the idea, so Jackson Lewis, Lillard Mendelsohn, we need to have our attorneys in New Jersey. We need to have our attorneys in Minnesota. We need to have our attorneys in Atlanta. Well, what about now that, like, in the workplace, people are saying, well, maybe you don't need to go to work because you could do it remotely. Why wouldn't I say, you know what, I really love my attorney. I'm Coca-Cola, my in-house counsel. He's the best at arbitration. He's better than the others. Or I love my attorney who's in the San Francisco Lillard Mendelsohn office. Or I love my attorney at Gibbons, and we're opening nationwide. So why don't I just have James, and he could do arbitrations throughout the entire country. He could do it on Zoom. I don't have to pay for him to fly, and it'll be great.
Yeah, that was kind of a loaded question there, and I don't know if I'm fully equipped to answer it, nor have any authority on which to answer the specifics in which it was raised. But one, I think, benefit you're pointing to in the field of labor relations, whether it's a labor arbitration or proceeding before the National Labor Relations Board, is that you could be admitted in one state and practice on a national level. And yeah, that's something that's advantageous and perhaps something that clients may look to do with their preferred counsel across the country if this remote setting continues. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. I just want to answer it intelligibly and in light of the fact that I don't work for any of those firms. Well,
you work for Gibbons, but you wouldn't turn down the work if a client wanted you to do a Zoom arbitration for all their Zoom arbitrations for them, where the other side would agree. And so I won't make you answer that question. I'm just trying to point out the fact that maybe that's something that we could see going forward. There are a lot of things to be resolved. It may just be that everyone will agree with what seems to be the tenor on here, that Zoom is just pretty much a Band-Aid on the situation, or Zoom or WebEx or whatever else you want to call it. We're using Zoom, like Xerox kind of is just a broad generic term, that we're doing this because we're in a lockdown type situation. And when things return to normal, there won't be any need for this except under rare circumstances. But who knows, maybe that won't be the case. So I thank all of the presenters. I think you all did a terrific job. I hope that everyone who came enjoyed the program, learned something, and we'll be in touch with you about CLEs. To get the program that I've been referring to, Emily or Bernadette, maybe you could describe the process to go on the website to do that, to get the materials.
To get all the
opinion,
handouts?
yeah, right, everything that's in the booklet we put together.
Sure, I sent everyone an email last night. There's a link to it in what we call our C3. It's a discussion board. It's a community for everyone who attended today's training. It has all the handouts, like a 60-some page PDF, and it also allows you to look up any of the people that you met here today or heard speak here today.
You went out, Emily. You want to finish it, Bernadette? I think you know what she was going to say.
I
right?
think what she was going to say was that it'll allow you to connect and continue the conversation with anyone that you met today. Or questions. If you guys have questions, you can throw them out and continue the conversation on that C3. One thing though, if you didn't notice in the email, there is a little bit of a lag connection because it is an
and send them a private email, or you can always train.
You're back. You froze for a minute. We lost you.
So everybody should be
Okay.
able to go on the
All right, well-
website and download the booklet that includes this opinion and some other materials that we have.
Right. If you don't have access, give it a day, and you should have access if you were a late registry.
Great. And I just want to say, as a shameless plug, New Jersey Lira, thank you to all of our new members. We hope that you'll come to our programming, whether it's virtually or in person, however that ends up being in the fall. I think the state's reopening, so we hopefully will be back to in person, maybe with more social distancing than we're used to. And, I know Lira is having its annual conference on June 13th through the 16th. So that's something that now that you're members, you probably might want to take advantage of. There's all kinds of seminars you could pop in for 1 or 2 after you've registered, right? You don't have to register. You don't have to go. You don't have to spend the entire weekend. You could spend some of the weekend and see some great programming. So thank you for everybody. Please follow up with us with any questions that you may have, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Take care.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Theo.
Thank you, everyone.
Brady.
Thanks, enjoyed it.
Great, Jonathan.
Thank you. See you later.
All right.